Hold on there. Hi. So we are continuing the material on the presidency, and really today what we're talking about is how the powers of the president have evolved over time. It's quite dramatic, the difference in how the president behaves now, and that's not just President Trump. That goes back President Biden, President Bush, etc., are very, very different than how presidents behaved and how they saw their job in the 19th century, early 20th century. So to start with, if I can get this to go forward, sooner said than done. Uh, there we go. Um, During the early years, so George Washington, you think of all the presidents during that period of time, 1800 and 1933. And for the most part, they took a back seat to Congress. It's referred to as the legislative epoch. And they saw that the people's voice, remember, the presidents were more separated from the people. The Electoral College was involved, party conventions were involved. So they weren't quite as close and directly tied to the public. In contrast, the House of Representatives, that they were directly elected by the people, and it was seen as the president's responsibility to not push them, but to respond to them. They were the ones who are going to interpret the preferences of the public, the people's voice, and the president's role was to carry it out. This changed, as we've talked about, during the New Deal. During the New Deal, the people certainly wanted a change, but Congress wasn't delivering it. And a lot of people saw the role of the government, the federal government's role, as not including a lot of the things that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, proposed for the New Deal. He proposed dramatic changes in the responsibilities, the behavior, what the federal government would do, and how it related to the states. It introduced a whole range of agencies and responsibilities, but it was also done by the president. The president put out executive orders. The president was the one who proposed legislation and asked Congress to pass it. He didn't take a back seat to Congress. He led. And this was the initiation of a big change in how the president's role was seen by the public. This continued this way, and gradually, ever since really that period of time and going forward, they've talked about it, this term that they've talked about it as growing as the imperial presidency. The term actually was first used during the Nixon administration, but it's gradually been growing where the president has gained more and more power relative to the other branches, but especially relative to Congress. And relative also not just gaining at the expense of Congress, but also having more power with respect to the states and what the federal government would do. So one of the things is, and I won't go through the list, but originally the White House was a small office. There was the president, his immediate staff, and they were limited in what they could do. They would ask the agencies, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Justice, contact them, but they didn't have a big staff of their own. And starting in the 1950s or so, they created a broader entity called the Executive Office of the President. In the Executive Office of the President, one of the offices is called the White House. But there are others, the Office of Management and Budget, the I can't even think, the U.S. Trade Representative, but there's a whole host of different things. And there were people attached. So the president gained more access to hundreds of people who would work for him, and he could use to contact agencies and to have agencies follow through on the things he cared about. One of the areas this worked on is the second one, regulations. It used to be that a law was passed, an agency would interpret what that means, writing what's called a regulation, and it would be published in something called the Federal Register, and that would lay out how this law was supposed to work, answering the questions that the law had. Maybe the law left out some things, maybe it was vague in other areas. The regulation would fill it in. During Reagan's administration, there was a question since the 1980s now of were agencies using those regulations to expand their power and be able to do more things than a conservative administration would like. So what Reagan did was he created in the executive office of the president an entity that would collect the regulations of agencies before they became final, before they were public. Well, actually, they might have been public, but before they were finalized and put into effect. And this entity in the president's office would review them and evaluate them and make sure that they're not pushing power too high, too far, and they reflected the preferences of the presidency. And that expanded the president's authority. As we talked about, the third is military actions. The presidents have grown more and more willing to deploy force. And that's not just under Trump, that's going for 50 years. Small engagements, the presidents have sent troops. And presidents more and more have spoken out. President Trump was unique in how he used Twitter or whatever the variants, X, Truth Social, etc. But that his ability to directly speak to the American public with one voice like that is something unmatched. This is changing, though. And during the Trump administration, there's been some dramatic changes in how the president's authority has grown. And that's different than what was going on before. So I'm going to we'll talk about some of those changes. And for you, one of the papers that you're going to do, or the final paper, not one of the papers, the final paper you'll do in the last week, we'll look at some of these questions. But some of the areas, the ways that the president has used his authority is things that otherwise were responsibilities of Congress. For example, on the bottom here, it says move to dismantle USAID. That's the Agency for International Development. That was a congressionally established and funded agency. And that would have seemed that the president didn't have the unilateral authority to just go ahead and eliminate something that Congress created. Freezing programs or freezing grants, all of that. The president hasn't been perceived as having the ability to just stop spending money that Congress appropriated. That wasn't considered part of his authority. Firing in the right hand, upper right, firing inspectors generals. Those are the people that are supposed to evaluate and do inspections, do assessments for fraud, waste, and abuse, and so forth. And they are supposed to be reporting to Congress. So they're independent of the administration. They're supposed to be perceived not as reflecting whatever the president wants, but giving an impartial assessment of what an agency is doing. Likewise, the National Labor Relations Board is also independent, and it's supposed to be include Democratic and Republican members, and President Trump just fired all the Democratic members. Federal prosecutors, who he did either prosecuted things associated with January 6th or other sorts of things that were deemed undesirable, he's fired them. And so these are new actions, things that are different than his predecessor. The TikTok China was required, or the company that owned it was required to divest itself, get rid of TikTok, and Trump wanted to pass it on to someone in America. So he didn't enforce the ban, what Congress had passed, for about a year. So let's try this video, see if this works. Okay, let's go.
In just 3 weeks in office, President Donald Trump has done a lot.
That's a good one. Birthright.
Firing at least a dozen inspector generals.
The sweeping freeze on all federal grants.
USAID, run by radical lunatics. Could you imagine Biden doing this? I don't think so.
And he's using that fire hose of action not just to move quickly on campaign promises, but to test the traditional limits of presidential power.
He is testing the boundaries that are established by Congress and the boundaries established by the courts.
President Trump is paying no attention to laws that limit his power or to the Constitution that limits his authority.
The Constitution set up checks on the president's power. Here's how those checks are working now, and what would have to happen for it to become a constitutional crisis. Let's look at USAID as an example, since that's the first agency the Trump administration is attempting to dismantle. But this system applies to all agencies, from the Department of Education to the Environmental Protection Agency. It all starts in Congress. They draft legislation that directs what the agency should do and how much money they should get for it. For example, here's the law introduced by then-Senator Marco Rubio, who may be in charge of USAID now. More on the legality of that in a minute. During Trump's first term, it gives direction to USAID to provide education for displaced children and build those institutions in coordination with private and civil society organizations. The employees of USAID then take that direction and budget from Congress and do the work of actually making it happen. But like all federal agencies, it's managed by the executive branch. So the president oversees these employees and how they spend the money. Through the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, the president also oversees the U.S. Treasury, which handles the distribution of congressionally mandated money. In his first 3 weeks, Trump has tried to essentially take over these parts of the system from Congress. He ordered the money for federal programs be stopped. He let Elon Musk's Doge access sensitive payment systems. And with USAID, he's ordered it to be moved under the State Department, led by Secretary Marco Rubio.
It sounds like you're going to wind down USAID.
Yes, sounds like it.
He also fired hundreds at USAID and ordered every employee on administrative leave.
If there's going to be a reduction in the funding of allocated funds for USAID, Donald Trump, the president, should work with his Republican majority in Congress to accomplish that.
So how can Congress check this? Their role is to set this framework in the first place, not so much enforcement, impeachment being the main thing.
There's the possibility that Congress could refuse to confirm, say, cabinet nominees that the president wants. Congress could pass laws that further limit presidential power.
Like they did in the 70s when President Nixon tried to freeze federal funds. Congress reaffirmed the legality of it with
the Impoundment Control Act from 1974 that says if the president doesn't want to spend it, he has to let Congress know, and Congress could choose to approve not spending it in 45 days. But the president has no unilateral authority to refuse to spend money.
Republicans who have majorities in both houses seem uninterested in checking Trump.
So far as I'm concerned, Chad, this is not a usurpation of authority in any way. It's not a power grab. I think they're doing what we've all expected and hoped and asked that they would do for years.
They also confirmed Trump's chief architect of this strategy, a Project 2025 author, to run OMB after the attempt to freeze funds.
The president ran on the notion that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. I agree with that.
The main check is really the responsibility of the federal courts after there's been a challenge to the law. There are dozens of lawsuits already filed, and in some cases, the courts already ordered injunctions against the administration. They immediately stopped Trump's order to freeze federal funds, and later stopped Doge's access. President Trump even tried to order that birthright citizenship was unlawful. Courts immediately stopped that too.
they're going to lose that litigation in the courts. They already have in the lower court.
And as for USAID,
he's claiming as president that he has the right to fire anyone in the executive branch of government. The Supreme Court has previously rejected that argument. It's another place which is a blatant violation of the law. Many people have been fired illegally in violation of federal law. I expect that they will sue in court and that they will win.
a federal judge appointed by Trump stopped USAID's employees from being put on leave, at least temporarily.
There are problems in USAID, but there's a way to address it. Have the Inspector General address the corruption and the conflicts of interest, have Congress have hearings, and do it the way the founders intended.
A lot of what Trump is doing is causing uncertainty, but legal experts say a lot can be stopped or reversed through the legal system. But that's a slow process, and what it would take to undo the damage at USAID is uncertain. Those experts also think these actions are a test to see if the courts might give the executive branch more authority than it has in the past, especially at the Supreme Court, where 3 Trump appointees sit.
They are hoping to test some boundaries with respect to some Supreme Court precedents, and they think this current court might be willing to grant more power to the presidency than has been granted to the presidency in the past.
Like with Trump's executive order to abolish birthright citizenship.
In the Supreme Court, I think we're going to win that case, and I look forward to winning it.
And especially with the freezing of federal funds.
Eventually, part of it will have to be resolved at the Supreme Court. The theory that the appropriations, which is statutory, because it comes in that bill, is a ceiling. And he as executive and chief executive officer has a wide range to actually make a determination if it's not fulfilling the program or if the program is off kilter, that he has the ability in the impoundment to impound the money and go take it.
He's pushing the envelope across the board to see what he can get away with and how much presidential power he has.
This entire system of checks and balances also assumes the president will follow the court's orders.
The court has no power, really, to enforce its own judgments against the other branches of government.
Still, presidents have typically listened to court rulings.
President Trump, in his first term, didn't like a lot of the court orders, but he complied with it.
In his second term, his administration is questioning the judges. Immediately after one ruling, Vice President Vance said judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power.
No judge should frankly be allowed to make that kind of a decision. It's a disgrace.
If Trump decided to ignore a court order, experts agree that's when it would become a
constitutional crisis of a sort we've never seen before.
If Trump's bet is successful and he is able to go unchecked at dismantling USAID, he could use the same playbook to try it again with the long list of other government agencies he's already set his eyes on.
Okay. So, good. There we go. Hold on. So in general, there's 3 ways that the Trump administration has been expanding power. Let me get this a little nicer. Oops. There we go. 3 ways: through emergency declarations, personnel, and funding. And each of them I'll talk about now. Emergency declarations, that's the easiest in a way. And that's the case where the president declares an emergency. There's existing authority that gives him special powers in an emergency. The tariffs that were imposed, he relied on that there's an emergency that required that. Because of energy, he said we can go in and start drilling and mining on federal lands, and to put the border wall and troops on the southern border, also an emergency. In specific, it was the National Emergencies Act, 1976. And when he says there's an emergency, he can say for almost anything. And for example, the ballroom, right? You've heard about knocking down the east wing of the White House in order to build a ballroom. He wants to go forward with the ballroom. The courts have stopped him, saying you have to go through Congress and get an approval. And he said there's an emergency that because this new ballroom is going to have some protections, it's, in the roof or something like that, based on this emergency act, I need to go forward and build this without getting congressional approval. The tariffs are another one, and there's a list down here of emergencies. But it's been, in the past, for many, many years, it was used like after the Iran hostage crisis. I mean, it was a big deal when people declared an emergency. And that has been exploited in recent years. So where presidents were restrained from sort of treating it as a loophole, treating it as, I'll just declare it as an emergency and do whatever I want. That's changed in recent years. And the two most recent examples are in Trump's first term. He didn't get all the money he wanted for building his border wall. So what he did was declare a national emergency and take money that had been appropriated to the Department of Defense for a certain set of activities, drug war, and use it for building the border wall. And, the whole premise is Congress is supposed to decide what to fund. And so this was a big deal, but he said because of the emergency, he would use that authority to shift the money for a different purpose than Congress intended. And another example is that Biden, because of the COVID situation, declared an emergency. That's fine, if he used it for some public health purposes. But then he used it to forgive student debt. And, you can see how, what's the connection there? This is just a list of previous examples. And you can see, I think it was just one or so under Carter. With George Herbert Walker Bush, you had when we were attacked on 9/11 and so forth. So not many. This is just a list for you. I'm not going to talk about it, but various examples of using this emergency act, the southern border, blocking drugs, putting tariffs rather on Canada because supposedly drugs were coming. So you're able to, with these emergency acts, not actually have to show proof. You can just say all kinds of drugs are coming across the border from Canada. The president can do that. And he can just say that's the case and impose tariffs as punishment or something like that. So that's the first one. The first one there is the use of the Emergency Act has been a way of expanding power. For these second two, on personnel and spending, will be relevant to that final paper. So for personnel and spending, it relies upon something different. So in the Constitution, the presidency is Article 2. That's the thing that's blocked by my face right there. And Article 2 starts out, with what's called the vesting clause. It starts out by saying the executive power shall be vested, that means held or concentrated, in a president of the United States of America. And that then means, okay, when it says the executive power is vested in this way or, concentrated in this way, what does that mean? What authority does that give the president? In the past, it just was treated as, not really important, but it's been raised now as potentially having a significance and importance. And as the same thing, how does this language affect the relations with Congress? I would point out that there's vesting clauses of this sort before each of the different articles in the Constitution. You can see there's a vesting clause in the first one for the Congress. All legislative powers herein shall be granted or vested in the Congress of the United States. There's the presidency. And then the judicial powers shall be vested in one Supreme Court. So each of them it's like an introduction to the section. But in the case of the presidency, what's happened recently is that supporters of President Trump, and in particular, the whole Project 2025, have asserted that it means the president controls everything in the White House. And that's called, and not the White House, in the executive branch. The concept, the theory is called the unitary executive theory. And I will now show you a video on that. So if you'll, which I think is helpful. Hopefully. Let me. Okay.
President Donald Trump is using a popular conservative legal theory to
restore that original vision of the presidency that the Constitution creates,
where I have the right to do whatever I want as president.
Like fire thousands of federal workers, dismantle entire agencies, and oversee what were created as independent regulatory agencies. The Supreme Court will be the deciding factor on this executive power reach that critics say
is far more extreme, but which would, I would argue, fundamentally change how the country runs.
Here's the legal theory and the point of President Trump's executive actions and why the Supreme Court might allow this expansion of executive power. The ideology is called the unitary executive theory, that Article 2 of the Constitution, which creates the president, puts all of the executive power in a single unitary president.
This is not new, and it's not a theory. It's a description of what the framers did in Article 2.
Read Article 2, which gives the president powers that you wouldn't believe.
But there are still questions about just how much power and over what. It's well established in the Constitution that the president oversees these cabinet agencies. What's not as defined are independent agencies, things like the FTC, SEC, CFPB, largely economic watchdog and regulatory agencies created by Congress and signed into law by the president. They were designed to be insulated from politics and changing administrations. But they're Trump's primary target. In one executive order, President Trump brought these independent agencies under the executive branch.
Trump is arguing there should not be these independent agencies.
Michael Waldman runs the Brennan Center at NYU Law and has written extensively about the dangers of the unitary executive theory.
It would undo a lot of what we rely on now to regulate the economy, to police the stock market, to assure competition in markets.
That executive order cites Article 2 and the unitary executive theory that says that all employees are subject to the president's supervision. It's his justification for firing, so far, thousands of them.
He's trying to act horizontally, make all the heads of the federal executive agencies responsible to him, and then he's also trying to act vertically.
John Yoo has long advocated for the theory. During the Bush administration, he argued in the torture memos that Article 2 gave the president executive authority to use enhanced interrogation techniques.
President Trump is saying, look back at that unitary executive theory. Why should all those hundreds of thousands of employees be protected from removal too?
And Trump has fired top officials at some of these independent agencies.
The Constitution is clear that when it comes to principal governmental officials, that the president appoints with the advice and consent of the Senate. So it's kind of a harder question. Under what circumstances can Congress place restrictions on the president's ability to remove someone?
It's a harder question, but not a new one. In the 1930s, President FDR fired William Humphrey, the head of the FTC, for political reasons. The Supreme Court ruled the Constitution did not give illimitable power of removal to the president, and the chairman could only be removed for cause.
What the Trump administration is likely to ask the Supreme Court to do, and there's a chance they will, is to overturn that case.
Another, in the 80s, looked at the legality of a judicial independent counsel, and if they could be protected from presidential removal. The court said yes.
But there was one justice who thought that this was a core executive function, and that was Justice Scalia.
The Constitution did not leave the president's powers at our mercy. It says that the executive power, not some executive power, shall be vested in a president of the United States, not a president of the United States and others.
And although he was the only justice in the dissent, that particular dissent has become kind of a rallying cry for people who have broader conceptions of executive power.
Trump has also claimed that it's his right as the executive to stop payments that Congress has authorized, called impoundment, which goes against a 1970s law.
This disaster of a law is clearly unconstitutional, a blatant violation of the separation of powers.
It's an aggressive and novel conception of the unitary executive theory.
It is an audacious power grab, cloaked in legalistic language. And it's going to be up to the Supreme Court to stand up to it.
It's quite plausible that President Trump is intentionally creating a test case.
Legal experts believe part of the point of Trump's exertion of this authority is to give the Supreme Court opportunities to overturn these precedents.
The Roberts Court, in a way, has been building this for 20 years.
In a case 5 years ago about whether the president could remove the head of CFPB, the court found he could. Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch argued that the previous precedent protecting independent agencies is an unfortunate example of the court's failure to apply the Constitution as written, and that those agencies encroach on the power of the executive.
If the Supreme Court agrees with the maximalist and extreme interpretation of the unitary executive theory in the cases that will be coming before it, it would upend much of the economy and really have us far closer to the control of a king than a president affected by the rule of law and checks and balances.
So if Congress passes policy and a budget for these agencies, can the president just not do it?
Suppose President Trump doesn't want to spend the money Congress wants to spend. He doesn't want to regulate what Congress wants to regulate. That is a kind of problem, I think, that the founders' system doesn't have clear checks on, except for impeachment. They were quite clear that failure to execute the law would be a high crime and misdemeanor worthy of removal from office. If you see the president acting in aggressive ways, maybe it's because Congress actually supports him.
The people elected me to do the job, and I'm doing it.
I would say we don't really have a true separation of powers fight here because this Congress supports President Trump.
A lot of this comes down to what should the role of government be in protecting consumers, protecting the environment, and so on. Whatever other legal dimensions there are, this would likely make it so that much of the time these independent agencies would have their wings clipped by the executive branch.
Hey, did you know that SMUD is now paying Sacramento homeowners thousands of dollars upfront to put a backup battery system in their home?
Okay, so as I said, there's two areas that, so we talked about emergency, the use of emergency authority, that's been expanded dramatically, and in personnel and funding. That's the other area that's been changed. And the president is relying on the unitary executive theory. So you'll have to think about your views on that. Let's talk about each of these separately, though. Personnel and funding. With personnel, here's some examples that this was the first Trump administration, that they would just leave people in acting in order not to send them to Congress for approval, for ratification, but that's not as important. So one is the independent inspectors general. They're supposed to be watchdogs, fighting waste and corruption. So they're not supposed to be, they're appointed with the expectation that they can potentially embarrass an administration, that they can report on corruption, they can report on waste, malfeasance, and that they are supposed to report to Congress. Well, President Trump just fired them all last time and this time as well. And, it's hard to do oversight of the administration. If you're in Congress, if they won't let you. And another thing was they changed the role. We talked about civil service in class, how they were selected to be apolitical, selected to carry out the goals, the design of the program. President Trump created a new category in which he converted a lot of the civil service people to where they had some policy content and made it so that they could be fired for not carrying out the president's wishes. it gets really tricky when in different types of agencies. So here are the types of agencies. You have cabinet, that's all the things that start with Department of Homeland Security, Department of Health and Human Services, this one on top, HUD is Department of Housing and Urban Development. All of those are Department of Justice, Department of Commerce, Department of State. All of those are the cabinet, and the directors, that is the cabinet secretary of something, is selected by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and is supposed to carry it out. There's regular independent agencies like the EPA and NASA, and then the others that are really at the hot button of a lot of this discussion are agencies that are created to be independent and apolitical. So the Federal Reserve Board is a big one. Securities and Exchange Commission. What if the president said, I want to, the Security and Exchange Commission is supposed to do oversight on the stock market and the commodities exchanges, ensuring that it's done appropriately. Should a president be able to decide what he's going to prefer and what he isn't? So before we talk about the independent agencies, I'll just give you Department of Justice. The president has singled out a number of individuals, these are some of them, and said, these are bad actors. These are bad people. They've gone after me in some way. They've criticized me. They, wanted to. Jack Smith was the independent counsel who was investigating him before Trump was elected. Christopher Wray was in the FBI. Letitia James was the attorney general in New York that indicted him and convicted him of, I forgot, it was a financial issue. James Comey, also from the FBI. John Bolton had just been a critic of President Trump. Adam Schiff was in the House of Representatives. Anyway, he directed the Department of Justice to go after them, to investigate and prosecute them. Now, simply because the president thinks that they're bad actors doesn't necessarily mean that it'll succeed. But should the president be able to do that? Direct who would be prosecuted? Another example is the Federal Communications Commission, another independent agency. And in one case, the Brandon Carr, who is the chair and very political, said essentially that unless ABC fired Jimmy Kimmel, who has a late night show, then there'd be problems for them. And they were actually trying to get a merger with another company. So they knew that if the FCC was going to be their enemy, they wouldn't get their merger. And what happened? Jimmy Kimmel got fired, at least for a while, until there was a great deal of blowback. You can see 60 Minutes, the bottom corner, that President Trump was threatening to take away their license. So that's the problem when independent agencies that are supposed to be apolitical are put under the president. So they're expected, that the independent agency is expected to behave politically. Another case is there's a guy, Chris Krebs, who said essentially that the election, the 2020 election, was free and fair. His job was supposed to look at whether there was corruption or whether there was some kind of interference, and he said there wasn't. So President Trump issued an executive order essentially saying he should be prosecuted and take away his security clearances and so forth. I'm not going to show this one now, but you can look at it later. The last category is funding. How much authority should the president have? Should the president be able to make decisions after Congress appropriates money? Should the president be able to decide where the money should go or how it should be spent? And there's two ways this can be dealt with, or that are two questions, issues. One is, can the president divert money, choose to spend money in states that favor him as opposed to other states? Can he say, I'm going to punish a district or a state that isn't supporting me or is critical? And then the other question is, can he not spend money? So the first is, can he choose to allocate grants and other money disproportionately to red states or his allies? How much should the agency carry that out and give money that was appropriated, let's say, for environmental protection or children's health or health care? Can the president say, don't give so much to California? They vote against me. Give more to Mississippi and Alabama. Is that appropriate? Does the president have that power? Or is that congressional in the power? How much authority should the president have in making that judgment? And then the other question is something called an impoundment. Impoundment simply means not spending the money appropriated. So the president says, I don't like this money being spent at all. I don't think we should do environmental protection. I'm against climate change. Or, as you saw, the international economic development, international assistance for other countries. The president didn't want it and went after the Agency for International Development. This is the grants. This should have been in the other. This is how President Trump targeted grant money. But this is withholding grant money, something like that. And a pocket rescission was a technique where, as we got closer to the end of the year, he just said, I'm not going to spend this money. Anyway, those are questions. These are questions that you'll have to think about. What's appropriate? What is the role of the president as opposed to Congress? Does Congress have the right to appropriate money to expect to see it go where they appropriated it? Or does the president, as the leader of the executive branch, have the authority to move money to best accomplish, in theory, the goals that he sees appropriate? And one impoundment in the last administration was President Trump. There's money that was appropriated for military aid to Ukraine. And President Trump wanted to get Zelensky to say before the election he was doing an investigation of Biden because the Biden family is corrupt. And Zelensky said, no, don't get me involved in that stuff. Because President Trump wouldn't provide the money that Congress appropriated, he was impeached. But it didn't go further than that. Anyway, that's what we got. And let me know if there are any questions.